My name is Anna. I'm in my late 30s now, but this story begins when I was younger, old enough to believe hard work could outpace time, young enough to think responsibility was something you could schedule. I work in a field where people talk about impact and growth as if they're clean, upward lines. On the surface, I fit the profile people trust: dependable, thoughtful, not loud. The kind of woman colleagues describe as solid, family members describe as strong, and strangers rarely notice at all. People often underestimate me in a quiet way, not by insulting me, but by assuming I'll adapt, that I'll wait, that I'll absorb inconvenience without protest. I learned early that when you don't demand space, the world is happy to let you shrink. I wasn't invisible, I was useful. And that distinction matters more than it sounds. This is not a story about revenge. There's no villain pacing in the shadows, no dramatic takedown, no moment where I raise my voice and everything finally makes sense. It's a story about choice, timing, and the kind of consequences that don't announce themselves until it's too late to negotiate with them. At its center is my father, sick for longer than anyone wanted to admit, proud in the way men of his generation often are, and quietly afraid of becoming a burden. And at its center is my career, something I built piece by piece, believing that stability would eventually give me the freedom to be present, to be generous, to be there when it truly mattered. I want to be honest about the emotional terrain of this journey. There were days of clarity and long stretches of rationalization. There were moments when doing the right thing felt identical to doing the easiest thing. And there was a turning point that didn't feel like a turning point at all when it happened. You already know two facts that define the edges of this story. I left my sick father to focus on my career, and later, the promotion came. He didn't make it. What you don't know, what I didn't fully understand until much later, is everything that lived in between those sentences. The quiet negotiations I made with myself, the assumptions others made about my availability, my resilience, my priorities. The way silence can look like agreement when it's really just a delay. I'm telling this now not to be absolved and not to ask for sympathy. I'm telling it because stories like this are usually simplified into lessons that feel neat and false. Life is rarely that accommodating. Sometimes there are no clean heroes, only people doing their best with incomplete information and irreversible clocks. So before we go any further, let me ask you something, gently and without judgment. Have you ever made a choice that made sense at the time, only to realize later that sense and meaning are not the same thing? To most people in my life back then, I was predictable in the best possible way, reliable, low friction, the person you could count on without needing to check in twice. At work, I was the one who took notes no one else wanted to take, who followed up when meetings ended in vague conclusions, who stayed late not because I was asked to, but because it seemed inefficient not to. I didn't advertise effort. I let results speak quietly and assumed they would be heard. They usually were, just not attributed. When projects succeeded, the credit moved upward, diagonally, anywhere but straight toward me. When something stalled, I was looped in as the fixer, not the face. It wasn't malicious. That's important. No one was actively trying to erase me. I simply fit too well into the background role I had been assigned without realizing it. Competent, calm, replaceable in theory, indispensable in practice. At home, the dynamic was similar, just softer around the edges. My father used to say, "You're the strong one," in a tone that sounded like pride but functioned like permission. Permission for others to worry less, to check in later, to assume I had it handled. Strength, I learned, often becomes an excuse for absence. My siblings called more frequently, but their calls were shorter. They asked how Dad was doing, not how I was. I lived closest to him, so it made sense that I'd be the one who noticed the changes first. The way his hands trembled slightly when he lifted a mug, the way he sat down more often during conversations, as if standing had become an unnecessary negotiation with gravity. Doctors used careful language. Manageable. Early stages. Let's monitor. And I translated that into calendars and deadlines. I told myself decline was gradual, which meant there would be time. Time to stabilize things at work. Time to earn flexibility. Time to be present later, when presence would be truly required. People around me accepted that logic easily. At work, my manager once said, half smiling, "You're so focused. I don't know how you do it all." It was meant as a compliment. I took it as confirmation that I was doing the right thing. At home, my aunt told me, "Your father doesn't want you to put your life on hold." That sentence did a lot of work for everyone else. No one asked what it cost me to be the responsible one. And I didn't volunteer the answer. I became skilled at compressing myself. Emotions were postponed. Fatigue was reframed as discipline. Doubt was treated like a distraction. I learned how to sound neutral even when the subject was heavy, how to say it's fine, in a way that ended conversations instead of inviting them. Looking back, I see how invisibility crept in, not as neglect, but as expectation. I was the one who would adjust, the one who wouldn't make things harder, the one who could handle complexity without needing reassurance. It's a role that feels honorable until you realize it comes with an unspoken clause. You don't get to ask for much. At work, I was described as steady. At home, as selfless. Both words landed the same way. They praised endurance, not presence, output, not cost. And I internalized it. I told myself that if I just held the line a little longer, everything would align. That once I reached a certain level, financially, professionally, I could exhale. I could be there without compromise. I could afford to slow down. What I didn't see yet was that everyone else had already made their calculations around my silence. My availability was assumed. My limits were theoretical. And my absence, from myself, from my father, from the moments that don't reschedule, was quietly normalized. This is who I was to them before anything broke, before any decision felt final, before I understood that being dependable can sometimes mean being taken at your word when you say nothing at all. The first moment I remember clearly didn't feel important at the time. That's what makes it stay with me now. It was a Tuesday, ordinary in the way most turning points are. I had stepped out of a late afternoon meeting to take a call from my father's doctor. I stood in the hallway near the emergency exit, the one with the flickering light and the faint smell of cleaning solution. The doctor spoke calmly, professionally, but there was a new note in her voice. Not urgency, precision. "We're seeing changes," she said. "Nothing dramatic. But I'd like you to come in with him next time." I asked when. "Soon," she replied. "Within the next week, if possible." I thanked her, ended the call, and checked my calendar before I checked my chest. 3 client reviews, 1 internal presentation, a planning session I was expected to lead, though not officially. I did the math quickly, the way I always did. I told myself I'd rearrange things. I didn't say when. When I returned to the meeting room, no one asked why I'd stepped out. The conversation had moved on without me. Someone summarized a decision I had already documented weeks earlier, and the group nodded as if it were new. I took my seat and listened, pen still in my hand, pulse slightly off rhythm. At the end of the meeting, my manager caught up with me in the hallway. "Quick thing," he said. "The leadership team wants to move the timeline up. I know you're juggling a lot, but you're the only one who can keep this clean." I hesitated, just long enough to notice it, not long enough for him to see it. "Of course," I said. That was the cut. Small, clean, almost surgical. At home that evening, my father asked how work was going. I told him it was busy. He smiled, the way he always did when he heard that word, as if busyness were proof of worth. "Don't worry about me," he said. "I'm fine." He said it with the confidence of someone who wanted it to be true. I wanted it to be true too, so I didn't mention the doctor's call. I told myself I'd wait until I had something definitive to say. Information before emotion. That was my rule. The appointment was scheduled for the following week. I moved it once, then again. Each time, the explanation was reasonable. Each time, no one pushed back. Not the doctor, not my siblings, not my father. At work, the project expanded. More visibility, more pressure. I was invited to meetings I hadn't been invited to before. Not as a decision maker, but as the person who would make it work. I noticed my name appearing more often in emails, always in the middle of the thread, never at the top. One afternoon, a colleague joked, "If anything goes wrong, we'll just give it to Anna. She'll sort it out." Everyone laughed, including me. That night, I sat in my car outside my apartment longer than usual. I stared at my phone, the unread message from the clinic glowing softly. I felt a tightening behind my eyes, but I didn't let it turn into anything actionable. I told myself this was what being an adult looked like, prioritizing the urgent, trusting that the important would wait. The thing about small cuts is that they don't bleed much. You don't feel weak afterward, you feel functional, capable, slightly numb in a way that feels like efficiency. No one around me noticed anything had shifted. Why would they? I hadn't said no. I hadn't missed a deadline. I hadn't raised my voice or dropped the ball. From the outside, everything looked exactly the same. But internally, a line had been crossed. Not dramatically, quietly. I had chosen momentum over interruption. I had decided, without naming it, that some things could be postponed without consequence. I didn't know yet how often that decision would repeat itself, or how natural it would begin to feel. Once the first compromise is made, the rest tend to follow more easily. Not because they're larger, but because they're framed as consistent. I told myself I wasn't choosing work over my father. I was choosing stability for later. I wasn't avoiding discomfort. I was managing priorities. Language is powerful that way. It can turn erosion into logic. At work, my role quietly expanded without my title changing. I was consulted before decisions, but rarely present when they were announced. I was asked to prepare materials for meetings I wasn't invited to attend. When I did attend, I sat near the wall, laptop open, capturing conclusions as if I hadn't influenced them weeks earlier. I noticed patterns. Who spoke first? Who was interrupted? Who was thanked? I noticed how often my contributions were paraphrased by someone else and received with enthusiasm that I had never been offered directly. I noticed how often I was described as support rather than strategy. Each time I told myself it didn't matter. I was playing a long game. Recognition would come when it was earned. That belief kept me quiet. It also kept others comfortable. At home, something similar was happening. My siblings' calls became updates rather than conversations. They asked what the doctor said, what the plan was, when might I be visiting next. The language assumed I was already coordinating things, already absorbing the logistics, already the point of contact. No one asked if I was overwhelmed. And again, I didn't volunteer the answer. My father's condition shifted in subtle ways. He tired more easily. He forgot small things, where he'd left his keys, the name of a neighbor he'd known for years. Nothing alarming enough to demand immediate action, enough to justify waiting one more week. I began to normalize absence. I told myself presence was not just physical, that providing financially, planning ahead, being on top of things counted too. I measured care in spreadsheets and timelines. It felt responsible. It also kept me at a distance I didn't fully examine. There were moments when the imbalance surfaced briefly, like a crack in glass. A colleague once said, "You don't really need credit, do you? You just like getting things done." It was said kindly. I nodded. I let it stand. My manager started scheduling over commitments I had already flagged. "You're flexible," he said, and I was. Or rather, I had taught him I would be. At home, my aunt mentioned that my father had asked about me more often. "He knows you're busy," she added quickly, as if to reassure both of us. I thanked her and changed the subject. Disrespect rarely arrives loudly. It arrives wrapped in assumptions you've already agreed to. It thrives on your consistency. Every time I stayed quiet, I reinforced the version of myself others relied on, the one who would adapt without complaint. I told myself this was maturity, that adults don't dramatize trade-offs, that love doesn't require constant proximity, that success would eventually give me the leverage to rebalance everything. What I didn't acknowledge was how tired I was becoming, not physically, but morally. Tired of translating my own needs into something smaller, tired of being praised for endurance instead of honesty, tired of feeling like my life was always slightly deferred. Still, I didn't stop, because stopping would have required me to admit that something was wrong. And admitting that would have forced a choice I wasn't ready to make. So I normalized it. The late nights, the postponed visits, the quiet resentment that never quite formed into anger. I became very good at functioning inside a system that benefited from my silence. By the time I noticed how automatic it all felt, the pattern was already established. And patterns, once set, are rarely questioned. until something breaks them. I didn't wake up one day and realize I had been assigned a role. It revealed itself gradually, through repetition, through what people expected of me without asking. Roles are rarely announced, they're inferred. At work, I was the stabilizer, the one brought in when projects drifted, when timelines slipped, when communication broke down between louder personalities. I wasn't there to lead, I was there to absorb friction, to translate chaos into clarity, to make other people look decisive. When a senior director once referred to me as our insurance policy, it was meant as praise. I smiled and thanked him. Insurance, after all, is valuable. It's also only noticed when something goes wrong. I wasn't included in early-stage vision conversations. I was included once the direction had already been set and needed execution. I was trusted with details, not with authorship, with responsibility, not authority. And because I delivered, the role hardened. At home, the role was different in language but identical in structure. I was the dependable daughter, the one who didn't panic, the one who would handle things. When my father's test results came in, they were forwarded to me. When decisions needed to be made, my opinion was asked for last, after others had already agreed that I would take care of it. I realized one evening, standing in my father's kitchen, that no one else knew where his medical documents were kept. Not because I'd hidden them, but because no one else had needed to know. I had quietly centralized responsibility without meaning to. My father noticed it too, I think. Once, when I offered to reschedule a visit because of work, he paused longer than usual before saying, "You don't have to be the strong one all the time." I laughed it off. Strength had become my currency. I didn't know how to spend anything else. The role I was assigned came with benefits. I was trusted, relied upon, left alone. No one hovered over me or questioned my competence. But it also came with a cost. My needs were invisible by design. You don't ask the foundation how it's feeling. You just assume it will hold. At work, junior colleagues came to me for guidance, not my manager. I trained people who would later outrank me. When I hinted carefully at wanting more visibility, I was told, "You're invaluable where you are." It sounded like security. It was actually containment. At home, my siblings planned visits around their schedules, assuming I would fill in the gaps. "You're so good with Dad," they'd say, as if skill negated fatigue, as if care were a trait, not an effort. I began to see how neatly everything fit together. The system worked because I didn't disrupt it. My silence wasn't just tolerated, it was required. The moment I asked for more, something else would have to give. Time, comfort, someone else's convenience. So I stayed in the role. Not because I was forced to, but because stepping out of it felt selfish. Because I had internalized the idea that wanting more recognition, more help, more presence, meant taking something away from someone else. What I didn't realize yet was that the role was already taking something from me, slowly, consistently, without ceremony. I was becoming very good at being essential and very bad at being seen. The day something shifted wasn't dramatic. There was no argument, no raised voices, no sudden diagnosis that forced a reckoning. It was a quiet day, almost forgettable, which is why it changed me. I was sitting in my car outside the hospital parking lot, engine off, hands resting on the steering wheel. I had arrived early for my father's appointment, early enough that I could have gone in with him. Instead, I was on my phone, scrolling through an email thread from work. A senior executive had added me to a message chain mid-conversation. "Can you clean this up?" the email read. No greeting, no context, just an assumption. I looked at the hospital entrance through the windshield. Automatic doors opening and closing. People moving in and out with folders tucked under their arms. Faces composed in that particular way people look when they're bracing for information. My father texted me from inside. "I'm here. Take your time." I felt something settle in my chest. Not sharp, not painful, heavy, like a realization that had finally finished forming. I could go in. I had the time. The meeting didn't start for another 40 minutes. No one at work knew where I was. No one would be inconvenienced if I waited to respond. And yet, my hand moved to the keyboard. "I'll take a look," I typed. I hit send, then sat there, phone still in my hand, as if waiting for something else to happen. Nothing did. The world didn't react. No alarms, no guilt. Just a quiet confirmation that I had chosen again. That was the moment. Not because of what I did, but because of how automatic it felt. I hadn't weighed the options, I hadn't debated values, I had simply responded in character. I put the phone down and rested my forehead against the steering wheel. For the first time in a long while, I didn't try to rationalize the feeling that followed. I let it be what it was, a recognition that I was living inside a role so well practiced it no longer required thought. I went into the appointment late. My father didn't comment, the doctor did. Her eyes lingered on me just long enough to register absence. Afterward, my father asked if everything was okay. I told him yes. He nodded, accepting the answer without pressing. We were both very good at that. On the drive home, I didn't turn on the radio. I let the silence stretch. I thought about all the times I had said later, as if it were a location I could eventually reach. I thought about how often I had postponed presence in the name of preparedness. I realized then that nothing external was going to force me to change. No one was going to tell me I'd gone too far. The system worked for everyone else. If something was going to shift, it would have to be internal, quiet, unannounced. That day, I didn't confront anyone. I didn't make promises to myself or draft exit plans. I didn't even change my behavior immediately. What changed was my awareness. I began to notice every time I defaulted. Every time I said yes without checking in with myself. Every time my silence made someone else's life easier at the expense of my own. It wasn't anger that drove the shift. It was clarity. And once clarity arrives, it doesn't leave just because you ignore it. I went to bed that night knowing one thing for certain. I couldn't keep living on autopilot and expect the outcome to be different. Something would have to give. I just didn't know yet what I was willing to let go of. After that day, nothing changed on the surface. I still showed up to meetings, I still answered emails quickly. I still visited my father when I could and told myself it was enough. From the outside, my life remained impressively stable. Internally, though, silence stopped being passive. Before, I hadn't spoken up because it didn't occur to me to do so. Now, I noticed every moment I chose not to. That awareness changed the quality of my quiet. It became deliberate. At work, I began to observe more than I contributed. Not in a disengaged way, but in a precise one. I stopped filling gaps immediately. When someone asked a vague question, I waited. When a meeting drifted without direction, I let it drift a little longer before stepping in. It was subtle, but the effect was immediate. People grew uncomfortable with the space I used to erase. No one commented. They simply adjusted, slightly at first, then more noticeably. I also stopped volunteering information that no one had asked for. I answered what was put to me, nothing more. I documented everything. Decisions, approvals, timelines, not to protect myself in any dramatic sense, but because I was beginning to see how often responsibility and credit were decoupled. Silence, I learned, can be strategic without being manipulative. It's not about withholding. It's about not compensating for other people's omissions. At home, I did something similar. I stopped preemptively managing everyone else's expectations. When my siblings asked how Dad was doing, I told them the facts and let the pauses sit. I didn't soften the edges or rush to reassure. If they wanted details, they had to ask. My father noticed. One evening, he asked me why I seemed farther away. I told him the truth, carefully, that I was trying to be more honest with myself about what I could and couldn't carry. He listened without interrupting. When I finished, he said, "That's probably overdue." I didn't interpret silence as weakness anymore. I saw how often people mistook my quiet for compliance, my calm for consent. I let them keep making that mistake. At work, assumptions continued. My manager scheduled me into overlapping commitments. A senior colleague forwarded a problem with the note, "You'll know what to do." I didn't know what to do, I just didn't do it immediately. No one confronted me, because nothing I was doing violated expectations outright. I was still performing, still delivering, just no longer cushioning the system. What surprised me most was how quickly people revealed their dependence on my unspoken labor. Small delays caused disproportionate stress. Questions I used to answer before they were asked suddenly became urgent. And still, no one said thank you. No one acknowledged the shift. They simply worked harder to reestablish the old pattern. At home, the effect was quieter. My siblings began visiting more often. Not out of guilt, out of necessity. I let that happen without commentary. This wasn't revenge, it wasn't punishment, it was recalibration. I wasn't withdrawing care or effort. I was withdrawing the assumption. And in that space, I began to see things more clearly than I ever had before. Silence, when chosen, is not emptiness. It's a mirror. And some people don't like what they see when they're forced to look. While everything looked the same to everyone else, my attention had shifted completely. I wasn't waiting anymore. I was preparing. I began to track patterns the way I used to track deadlines, methodically, without emotion. Who approved what? Who took credit for which outcomes? How decisions were framed after the fact? I kept notes, not out of paranoia, but out of respect for reality. Memory is unreliable. Documentation isn't. At work, I noticed how often my manager deferred upward without context, presenting conclusions as if they had emerged organically. I noticed how senior leadership referenced the team when things went well, and named individuals when things didn't. I noticed how my name appeared most frequently in the operational layer, rarely in the strategic narrative. So I began to position myself differently. I asked clarifying questions in writing instead of verbally. I summarized meetings in emails and copied stakeholders who were usually insulated from the process. I framed my contributions in terms of outcomes, not effort. I stopped smoothing over inconsistencies that made others look decisive. No one objected. Why would they? Everything I was doing was professional, transparent, efficient. At home, I applied the same discipline. I organized my father's medical information in a shared folder and gave my siblings access. I stopped being the sole interpreter of his condition. I asked doctors to address all of us together, even when it was inconvenient. My father watched this quietly. One afternoon, he said, "You're making it easier for them to be here." I told him that was the point. He nodded, as if something had finally aligned. I also began to prepare personally, financially, logistically. I reviewed the benefits. I mapped out scenarios I had avoided thinking about before. Not worst-case fantasies, but realistic outcomes. I asked myself hard questions about what I would regret more, stepping back now, or realizing later that I had never truly stepped in. What they never noticed was how much leverage lived in the background work I had been doing for years, the relationships I had built quietly, the institutional knowledge I carried, the trust I had accumulated without spending. They also didn't notice that I had stopped needing validation from the same places. My sense of worth was no longer tied to immediate recognition. It was tied to alignment. At work, an opportunity began to take shape, not offered but implied. A restructuring, a role that would consolidate influence without increasing visibility. I saw it for what it was, a way to extract more from me without changing the narrative. I didn't react. I listened. I asked questions. I took notes. At home, my father's condition stabilized briefly, then declined in a way that couldn't be reframed. The doctor used firmer language. "We should talk about timelines," she said. No one argued. Through all of this, I remained outwardly calm. That calm was misinterpreted as certainty, as commitment, as availability. What no one saw was that I was no longer deciding in real time. I was comparing futures, measuring costs, preparing for an outcome that would require me to live with myself afterward. The work I was doing then wasn't visible because it wasn't performative. It was internal, structural. And once it was complete, the next step would not be negotiable. The private reveal didn't arrive as a shock. It arrived as confirmation. By then, I had already sensed it, like noticing the weight of a door before you try to open it. You know which way it's going to swing. You just don't know how hard it will be to hold. At work, the restructuring was no longer hypothetical. I was asked to step into a role that didn't exist on the org chart yet. No title change, no announcement, just expanded scope and future consideration. The language was careful, flattering, and empty in the ways that matter. I asked one question that shifted everything for me. How will this role be evaluated? There was a pause, not long, just long enough. We'll figure that out, my manager said. You've always been flexible. That was the moment the truth crystallized. Not emotionally, logically. I saw the full shape of the pattern end to end. My value was not in my growth. It was in my elasticity. I could stretch without breaking, and the system depended on that. At home, a similar clarity emerged, quieter but heavier. During a follow-up appointment, the doctor stopped using timelines like months and started using words like focus and comfort. She spoke directly to me, then caught herself and looked at my siblings as well. I watched their faces change. I recognized the moment when information becomes real. Afterward, in the parking lot, my sister said, "I didn't realize it was this serious." I almost said I did, but I didn't. This wasn't about being right. That night, I sat alone at my kitchen table long after the dishes were done. I placed my father's old wristwatch in front of me, the one he'd given me years earlier when I got my first promotion. "So you don't forget time," he'd said, half joking. I turned it over in my hands and did something I had avoided until then. I allowed myself to imagine both outcomes fully, not just professionally or emotionally, but existentially. In one version, I accepted the role. I kept moving upward in increments that looked impressive from the outside. I visited my father when I could. I managed the aftermath competently. I lived with the knowledge that I had done what was expected of me. In the other version, I disrupted everything. I stepped out of momentum. I risked being misunderstood professionally and personally. I chose presence without guarantees. Neither version was clean. Neither came with moral certainty. But only one allowed me to live without splitting myself in two. The private reveal wasn't that one choice was right and the other was wrong. It was that both had costs, and pretending otherwise. This was no longer an option. I didn't celebrate this clarity. I didn't feel relieved. I felt sober. Because once you see the true shape of a decision, you lose the luxury of denial. And I knew, quietly, unmistakably, that whatever I chose next would define me more than any title ever could. The decision point didn't arrive with force. It arrived with silence, long enough that I could no longer pretend I hadn't seen what was coming. There was a single week when nothing demanded me urgently. No crisis emails, no late-night hospital calls, no sudden meetings added to my calendar. Not because everything was fine, but because everything was waiting for me to decide. I realized then that I had been unconsciously delaying this moment for years, not avoiding it, postponing it, the way you postpone a difficult conversation by telling yourself tomorrow will be clearer. It wasn't. So I did what I had always done best. I analyzed, not to soothe myself this time, but to be honest. I wrote down the options, stripped of comforting language. Option 1. Accept the role. An expanded position without a defined title, authority without protection, responsibility without boundaries, the promise of a promotion later, the same promise I'd been living on for years. I knew this path intimately. Every step looked reasonable. Every sacrifice could be justified as temporary. And every year, the finish line moved just far enough to remain respectable. I asked myself a question I had avoided until then. What will I tell myself in 5 years if I choose this again? The answer came quickly. I would say I did what was expected, not what was aligned. Option 2, ask for formal recognition. A title, clear authority, defined evaluation metrics, the things I should have requested long ago. On paper, it was the most rational option. In reality, I understood the culture too well. Asking for clarity would change how I was perceived, not upward but sideways. I would no longer be easy. I would become complicated. And in this system, complicated people were not pushed out. They were slowly excluded. Meetings stopped including them. Opportunities stopped finding them. The tone shifted. Polite, distant, final. I had seen it happen. I knew better than to romanticize it. Option 3, take a temporary step back. Request leave. Pause. Focus on my father. Breathe. Many people would call this humane. I knew its hidden cost. In corporate life, pauses are rarely neutral. Momentum is not patient. Once it moves on, it doesn't circle back out of loyalty. I wasn't afraid of rebuilding. I was afraid of losing the voice I had spent years earning quietly. And then there was option 4, the one I had refused to name. Not pausing, not negotiating, but closing the door. Declining the role entirely meant breaking the version of me everyone had learned to rely on. Not loudly, not dramatically, but permanently. I would no longer be the person who absorbed excess responsibility without resistance. And once that image cracked, it could never be restored. This option offered no moral high ground, no comforting narrative. I wouldn't be able to say later that circumstances forced my hand. I would have to live with the fact that I chose differently. At home, my father was quieter than before. Not suddenly worse, just thinner somehow, as if his energy had begun rationing itself. He listened more than he spoke. One evening, as I folded his jacket, he looked at me for a long moment. "You're always in between," he said. I didn't argue. "You think you have to choose one side eventually," he continued. "But you already are choosing. You just haven't admitted it yet." That sentence stayed with me. I realized I had been living in decision avoidance so long that avoidance had become my default choice. And its cost was internal division. Never fully present anywhere, always partially absent everywhere. At work, my manager followed up. His message was casual, confident. He assumed my agreement. Everyone always had. I asked for 24 hours. That night, I didn't lose sleep because I was uncertain. I lost sleep because I was grieving. Not the future, but the past version of myself who believed patience alone would eventually create alignment. A hard truth surfaced, quietly but firmly. There is no convenient moment to live honestly. There is only one moment when you accept the consequences. The next morning, I made the call. I didn't mention the hospital, I didn't reference my father, I didn't frame it as a sacrifice. I told the truth, clean and unnegotiable. This role doesn't align with my direction. There was silence on the line, not long, but telling. "I didn't expect that," my manager said. "I understand," I replied. That was all. No attempt to persuade me. No alternative offered, just a subtle recalibration in tone, more cautious, more distant, as if I had stepped outside a shape they thought was permanent. After the call ended, I sat still for a long time. Not relieved, not triumphant, just clear. From that moment forward, nothing would be the same. Not loudly, not immediately, but irreversibly. And for the first time in years, I didn't ask myself whether I had done the right thing. I knew I had done the honest thing. After I declined the role, nothing exploded. That was the first thing I noticed. No angry emails, no urgent meetings, no dramatic shift in workload. If anything, the days that followed were almost unnervingly normal. Too normal. The kind of normal that exists when a system hasn't reacted yet, but has begun recalculating. I kept showing up, on time, prepared, focused. I did my job exactly as defined. No more, no less. What changed was invisible. I stopped positioning myself as the safety net. When problems arose outside my scope, I redirected them calmly. That decision sits with leadership. When timelines slipped, I documented causes instead of absorbing blame. When meetings lacked clarity, I asked for it, once, and let the silence do the rest. No confrontation, no announcements, just boundaries enforced through consistency. People didn't resist. They adjusted. At first, they assumed this was temporary. A mood, a phase. Perhaps they thought I was tired, or distracted, or quietly negotiating for something behind the scenes. I let them believe that. Behind the calm exterior, I was moving deliberately. I reviewed my finances with a clarity I hadn't allowed myself before. Not out of fear, but realism. I mapped what flexibility actually looked like, how long I could sustain reduced income if necessary, what benefits mattered, and what didn't. I stopped optimizing for prestige and started optimizing for time. I spoke with HR, not to complain, not to escalate, but to understand policies, leave structures, exit clauses. Nothing adversarial, just information. Always framed as curiosity. At the same time, I began quietly reconnecting with people I trusted outside my immediate hierarchy. Former colleagues, mentors who had left the company, people who understood the system well enough to speak honestly about it. I didn't ask for favors, I asked questions. What happens when someone like me says no? How long does it take for perception to shift? What does recovery look like, really? Their answers were calm, unromantic, useful. At home, my movements were just as intentional. I rearranged my schedule around my father's energy instead of my calendar. Mornings became slower. Appointments were no longer squeezed between calls. I was there, not constantly, but fully. My siblings noticed. They didn't comment on it directly. They just followed suit. Visits became longer, conversations deeper, responsibility redistributed without discussion. I didn't manage the shift, I allowed it. My father watched all of this quietly. One afternoon, as we sat together, he said, "You seem lighter." I didn't correct him. I wasn't lighter, I was steadier. There's a difference. At work, subtle consequences began to surface. Emails stopped being addressed to me by default. My name appeared less frequently in threads where decisions were being made and more often where execution was expected. The unspoken contract was adjusting. If she's not endlessly flexible, she's not endlessly central. I didn't react. This was predictable. What surprised me was how little it hurt, because I had already accepted the cost. The promotion process continued without me, quietly, efficiently. Someone else stepped into the space I had declined. They were capable, eager, visible. I wished them well, genuinely. I wasn't withdrawing from ambition. I was withdrawing from misalignment. What no one seemed to notice was that I hadn't lost leverage. I had clarified it. The work I did now was traceable, defensible, clean. If it succeeded, the impact was obvious. If it failed, the cause was shared. And because of that, my calm unsettled people more than anger ever would have. There is something deeply destabilizing about someone who doesn't argue, doesn't over-explain, and doesn't chase validation. Silence, when paired with consistency, removes all the usual handles people use to pull you back into place. I didn't announce any future plans. I didn't threaten departure. I didn't hint at dissatisfaction. I simply behaved as someone who knew exactly what she was doing. And that, more than anything, forced the system to respond, on its own timeline in its own way. By the time anyone realized that something irreversible had already been set in motion, it was far too late to stop it. Consequences rarely arrive all at once. They arrive unevenly, touching different people at different times, so no one immediately recognizes them as consequences at all. At first, what others felt was an inconvenience. A meeting ran longer than expected because no one stepped in to summarize. A decision was stalled because the person who usually translated vague direction into action didn't volunteer. An email thread grew messy, circular, unresolved. My name was no longer the quiet solution at the bottom of the problem. People adapted the way organizations always do, by redistributing discomfort. Small frustrations began to surface in tones that were still polite, but tighter. I heard it in the pauses before people spoke to me, in the extra context added to questions that used to be thrown at me casually, in the subtle recalibration of expectations. Someone once said, half joking, "We really used to lean on you." I smiled. I didn't correct them. What they were experiencing wasn't loss yet. It was withdrawal symptoms. At work, leadership began noticing delays without immediately understanding their source. Metrics slipped slightly, not catastrophically, but enough to provoke discussion. Processes that had once felt smooth now required effort. In meetings, people started asking, "Who owns this?" That question hadn't been necessary before. I watched carefully, not with satisfaction, but with curiosity. I had spent years absorbing friction so others could move quickly. Now friction had returned to its rightful place, the center of decision-making. No one blamed me outright. That would have required acknowledging how much invisible labor I had been doing. Instead, my name was simply absent when people talked about key drivers. At first, that absence felt strange. Then it felt accurate. The promotion went to someone else, publicly, cleanly. Congratulatory emails circulated. Applause emojis appeared. I added mine without hesitation. What people didn't see was how quickly the new structure revealed its weak points. Not because the person promoted was incompetent. They weren't. But because the system had been optimized around my elasticity. Now rigidity showed. Questions escalated higher. Decisions took longer. The buffer was gone. Still, no one said anything directly. Organizations don't grieve quietly lost contributors. They reframe. At home, the consequences were heavier, but clearer. My father's condition declined in increments that no one could argue with anymore. There were more appointments, longer conversations with doctors, fewer illusions about timelines. Because I was present, truly present, I noticed details that might have been missed otherwise. The way he conserved energy, the way his eyes lingered on ordinary moments, as if memorizing them. My siblings noticed too, and for the first time they didn't default to me. They showed up, not dramatically, just consistently. Care was shared instead of centralized. Decisions were made together instead of being filtered through me. No one thanked me for stepping back. They didn't need to. The cost was obvious in their faces now. At work, subtle questions began to surface. "Are you happy here? What's next for you? You seem different." I answered honestly but briefly. I didn't reassure. I didn't deflect. "I'm clear," I said. Clarity makes people uneasy when they haven't reached it themselves. My manager scheduled a one-on-one after several weeks of distance. The conversation was careful, exploratory. "We're noticing some strain," he said. "Things aren't moving the way they used to." I nodded. He didn't accuse me. He couldn't. Everything I had done was within bounds, measured, professional. "We may need to rethink how responsibilities are distributed," he added. I agreed. What he didn't say, but felt, was that the system was experiencing loss without a clear object to blame. And that is the most destabilizing kind. At home, my father's decline accelerated in ways that made every hour feel finite. There was no panic, just gravity. One afternoon, he said, "I'm glad you're not rushing anymore." I didn't respond right away. There was nothing to add. That was when I understood the true nature of consequence. At work, the cost was inefficiency, confusion, and delayed recognition of structural dependence. At home, the cost had always been time. One could be corrected, the other could not. And while people at work were only just beginning to feel the absence of what I had quietly provided, I was already living inside the presence I had chosen, fully aware of what it had cost me to arrive there. The consequences had begun, not loudly, not vindictively, but undeniably. And they would continue, whether anyone named them or not. By the time panic appeared, it didn't look like panic. It looked like urgency dressed up as collaboration. At work, meetings multiplied. Check-ins that had once been optional became mandatory. Language shifted subtly, from confidence to concern, from assumption to verification. People began asking questions they should have asked months earlier. What was the original reasoning here? Who approved this change? Do we have a record of that decision? I had the records I always had. But now, instead of filling the gaps automatically, I placed the information where it belonged and let others carry the weight of interpretation. I didn't withhold. I didn't rescue. I responded when asked and stopped there. That distinction mattered more than anyone expected. Leadership tried to streamline processes that had worked only because I had been quietly smoothing them. Consultants were mentioned. Task forces formed. None of it recreated what had been lost, because what had been lost was not a system. It was a person's unpaid attentiveness. My manager checked in more often. His tone softened. "We didn't realize how much you were holding," he said once. I believed him. And I also knew it didn't change anything. Because realization without restructuring is just regret in polite language. There was a brief window where things could have been addressed meaningfully. Clear authority, defined scope, respect instead of reliance. But that window had passed the moment I declined the role. Now any attempt to fix it felt reactive. And reactive fixes rarely hold. At home, time closed in more quickly. My father began sleeping longer. Conversations shortened. Some days he didn't have the energy to speak at all. I learned how to sit with him without filling the silence, without pretending there would be another chance later. There wouldn't be. One evening, a doctor spoke quietly but firmly. "We're past planning," she said. "Now we focus on comfort." No one argued. There was nothing left to negotiate. My siblings arrived faster when I called. They stayed longer. They asked questions they hadn't asked before. Their urgency mirrored the one I had lived with for months. Only now it was shared. At work, urgency was misplaced. Deadlines were pushed. Explanations multiplied. People searched for efficiency where alignment had been the real issue. They wanted outcomes without confronting the cost of how those outcomes had been achieved. It was too late to fix it cleanly. The promotion track moved on. My name was no longer part of it. Not out of spite, but because systems rarely backtrack once they've reclassified you. I wasn't angry. I wasn't surprised. I had chosen, knowing this would happen. What unsettled others was not my departure from ambition, but my calm acceptance of consequence. I didn't negotiate my way back in. I didn't signal regret. At home, the final days arrived quietly. No dramatic last words, no revelations, just presence. I was there, not because I had earned the right, not because I had arranged my life perfectly, but because I had stopped running from the weight of time. When my father passed, it was early in the morning. The room was still, the kind of stillness that doesn't ask anything of you. Later, the call came from work. "We're ready to revisit your trajectory," my manager said carefully. "If you're open to it." I thanked him and declined, because by then, fixing it, professionally, meant returning to a version of myself I had already outgrown. Some things can be corrected if addressed early. Others, once delayed, become irreversible. Both truths lived side by side, and I had learned too late for one, just in time for the other, that timing is not a detail. It is the decision. The confrontation everyone expected never really happened. There was no raised voice, no accusation, no moment where years of restraint finally spilled over. What did happen was quieter, and because of that, harder for some people to accept. It was a scheduled meeting, calendar invite, neutral title, 30 minutes. My manager sat across from me with a version of concern that had learned how to sound professional. He didn't ask how I was doing. He asked how I was thinking. "We're worried we may have misaligned expectations," he said carefully. "I want to understand what you want." I appreciated the phrasing. It placed responsibility where it belonged, on understanding, not persuasion. I didn't list grievances. I didn't reference the past in detail. I didn't defend my decisions. I said, "I've been clear about my boundaries. What's changed is that I'm no longer willing to override them." He nodded slowly as if translating. "We value you," he said. "We always have." "I know," I replied, "but value and alignment aren't the same thing." That was the core of it. No heat required. He asked if anything could be adjusted. Scope, reporting lines, future opportunities. It wasn't desperation. It was genuine, but late. I told him the truth, that my priorities had shifted, and that any version of growth I pursued next would need to account for the full cost of participation, not just the visible parts. There was nothing to argue with, so he didn't. At home, the confrontation was even quieter. My siblings and I sat together after everything had settled. After the logistics, after the condolences, after the noise receded. No one blamed anyone. No one defended themselves. My sister said, "I wish we had realized sooner how much you were carrying." I nodded. I wish I had said it sooner. That was all that needed to be said. The absence of drama didn't make the conversations easier. It made them truer. There was no release valve of anger, no distraction of conflict, just clarity. Confrontation without heat doesn't feel like victory. It feels like a resolution. And resolution, I learned, is not loud. It doesn't demand witnesses. It simply leaves you able to breathe without bracing. When the meetings ended, when the rooms emptied, when the conversation stopped echoing, I didn't feel lighter in the way people talk about healing. I felt settled. Nothing had been taken back, nothing had been undone, but nothing remained unresolved. That was enough. I'm no longer the person people describe as able to handle anything. Not because I can't, but because I don't offer that version of myself anymore. What changed wasn't my competence. It was my identity. I stopped measuring my worth by how much strain I could absorb without complaint. I stopped confusing endurance with integrity. Today, my life looks quieter from the outside. Fewer meetings, fewer urgent messages, fewer situations that require me to disappear into function. I work, still, carefully, intentionally, but only in environments where responsibility and authority live in the same place. I no longer confuse proximity to power with impact. There are days when I miss the velocity, the sense of forward motion that comes from being constantly needed. But I don't miss the fragmentation, the feeling of being everywhere except where I was standing. I visit my father's grave without rushing. Sometimes I bring nothing. Sometimes I bring questions I no longer need answered. I don't replay the past, looking for alternate endings. I accept the one I lived. Guilt still visits, occasionally. It's quieter now, less accusatory, more like a reminder than a sentence. I listen to it without letting it drive. What I've learned is simple, but not easy. You can be responsible and still abandon yourself. You can succeed and still be absent. You can be loved and still be unseen. I don't carry resentment toward my workplace, my family, or myself. Resentment would imply I was owed something. I wasn't. I made choices within the limits I understood at the time. Now I choose differently. I spoke earlier. I document less for defense and more for clarity. I say no without apology and yes without performance. I show up where I'm present, not just useful. People who knew me before sometimes say, "You've changed." They're right. But what they mean is that I no longer make it easy for others to remain unchanged around me. That's not bitterness, that's honesty. I don't regret my ambition. I don't romanticize sacrifice. I don't pretend balance is static or guaranteed. I live with the knowledge that time doesn't wait for clarity. It waits for nothing. And because of that, I choose presence even when it costs me something, especially then. That is who I am now. There are stories that end with certainty. This isn't one of them. Nothing about what I lived through can be neatly labeled as right or wrong. There was no single moment where everything could have been fixed if I had only acted faster, braver, louder. Life doesn't offer that kind of editing privilege. It moves forward while we're still deciding what matters most. What this story gave me wasn't absolution, it gave me understanding. I learned that responsibility, when unexamined, can become a hiding place, that being reliable can slowly turn into being replaceable, that silence, when it's habitual, teaches people how much of you they're allowed to take. And I learned something harder, that love postponed is not love stored. It doesn't accumulate interest. It simply waits. And then it expires. I don't say that to shame anyone who is trying to survive impossible trade-offs. I know how heavy those choices feel when you're inside them. I know how convincing the logic of later can be when you're trying to build something stable enough to stand on. But time doesn't negotiate. The promotion came, he didn't make it. Those two facts can exist in the same life without canceling each other out. Success doesn't redeem absence. Loss doesn't erase effort. Both are true, and living with both is part of being human. If there is a moral here, it isn't about choosing family over career or career over family. It's about alignment, about noticing when your life starts requiring you to fragment yourself in order to function, about understanding that being indispensable to a system is not the same as being fulfilled within it. You don't owe anyone constant availability. You don't earn rest by breaking yourself first. And you don't need permission to choose presence, even when it disrupts expectations. Some of the most consequential decisions you'll ever make won't look brave when you make them. They'll look quiet, inconvenient, slightly disappointing to people who benefited from your silence. That doesn't make them wrong. I'm telling this story now not to offer a lesson, but an invitation to reflect, not to judge. So I'll leave you with this question, and I genuinely want to hear your answer in the comments. Have you ever realized, too late or just in time, that the life you were building required you to be absent from the one you were living? If you have, you're not alone. And if you haven't yet, I hope this story helps you notice before silence makes the choice for you.